you anyway, but those who are new to the third day of the conference, welcome. This is a fascinating lineup we have here today, and I'm happy to say that I can introduce you to the Deputy Mayor of the city of Ypres, Alderman Joseph Schoren, who is the president of the museum board, and he will have the first word of the day. Mr. Schoren.
Goedemorgen, iedereen hartelijk welkom. Good morning and welcome to you all, dear guests of this wonderful conference. As President of the Van der Fields Museum and first Deputy Mayor of the City of Ypres, I would like to give you a brief introduction into the work of our Van der Fields Museum and the challenges that lie ahead of us. As you perhaps know, the Van der Fields Museum was opened in 1989 with a double role. First and foremost, it needed to be a museum that could accurately tell the history of this city and this region during the First World War. If Ypres was to be a city of peace, then we had to explain where this ambition came from. We had to explain what our history of a destroyed city and region was, and how that fact was inspired us to this day to speak up in the alas always actual debate of war and peace in the world of today. The second role was that this museum needed to pass on that view that was born from personal experience into a next generation. As years went by, we were losing the generation of the 1418 war, and the danger was that with the people we might also lose their spiritual heritage. Our second task was therefore transgenerational and educational. To take up both roles, the museum felt that its main point of view had to be that of how the war was experienced by the people who found themselves involved in it, willingly or unwillingly. Our 1989 exhibition on the experience of war focused therefore far more on personal stories and on people's life than on military or geopolitical views of the war. Internationally, at that point in time, this was a voice that seemed to be missing in the representations of the Great War. The international public response to this approach was extremely positive, and in fact, much better than we had hoped for. We received on an average over the first 10 years 210,000 visitors annually. During that time, we had to take leave of that World War I generation altogether. Of the 12 veterans that were still present here on Armistice Day 1989, none was alive 10 years later. In the new exhibition, we have since introduced a new mediator, or a new witness, if you like, a final witness. Next to the war experience and the personal witness accounts, we now also use the present-day landscape as a final and lasting witness to the war. The new exhibition that you visited last night was opened in June 2012 and has now even more visitors than before. Last year, the first year of the centenary of commemorations, we received almost 500,000 visitors. but this was certainly an exception. In 2013, like probably also this year, the museum was and will be visited by some 300,000 visitors. And that's again a great success. This success is not only linked with Ypres being a particular international front, with people from more than 60 nations being involved, but also because this work goes back to our fascination for personal and local history. And, ladies and gentlemen, we have to admit, for our fascination for conflict. We all want to know how our uncle, or great-uncle, or great-great-uncle Joe was faring during the war. This success should not blind us. The very large interest in the war is not matched by an equal interest in the message of peace. We, as people living in this area and as political leaders of this city, we feel that there is a natural link between the past and the present, between the destruction by the war and the ideals of a more peaceful society. But in reality, one does not go necessarily with the other. It is not enough for us to have installed an Ypres Peace Prize. It is not enough to be an active member of Mayors for Peace. We have to do more to establish the self-evident link between a past of war and a desire for peace. We need to find our way. It is that this is apparently simple equation is not so self-evident. There is a big challenge to find answers to this question. It is important not only for Ypres, City of Peace, but also to put it here in front of this great gathering of specialists like yourselves. How can we turn the fascination for war of the past into a fruitful interest in a more peaceful future? If we can find that answer, we will have made an important step into fulfilling our ideals. I thank you. And now I give the word back to Mr. Piet Gillens, the coordinator, the living soul and heart of the In Flanders Fields Museum.
Bedankt, Chef. I agree that this is an important question, and that we're not going to answer today, I'm sure, but we can at last try. What I would like to do with you is just give you a very a small brief. We're talking about this morning about destroyed cities, and just to give you an idea, you've been going through this city for a few days now, and just to look at in pictures how it got destroyed and how it has arisen like a phoenix from its ashes, as they say. This is a picture of Market Day 1911. If you think you recognize it, you're right, because most of the buildings have been exactly rebuilt, with a few corrections here and there in the very neo-Gothic way of thinking the St. Lucas Guild of Architects looked to it that there was a spire now on the St. Martin's Cathedral. They said they didn't have money for that in the Middle Ages, and so we'll add one now in the 20th century. And then it starts. It starts, and the final picture is this. So, if we talk about a destroyed city, Ypres is one. What lies in between? Oh, if you think that you recognize something in here, that's also correct. To the far right, you see a wooden hut that says Café au Miroir. It still exists. It has replaced its wooden front by a stone house a few years later, but it's quite important that this city changed utterly in becoming a city that bore this past with it. And it was made into a city that had to also think of the memory of its war. I'll come back to that later. This is one of the examples. One of the very first means of living for the people was actually to build wooden huts so that they could receive visitors who came to Ypres to see for themselves what the story of the war was. It starts on the 7th of October, really, for the city. It's the first and last day of the arrival of German troops within the city. It's a Bavarian cavalry division on its way to the sea. And they don't think of leaving a garrison behind in Ypres, they just move on, as they had done through most of the country. They would never come back unless, of course, a few prisoners of war were taken back through the city. But this is the only time German troops were in the city. And you see in the background the cloth hall, with on its belfry tower a wooden scaffolding, which is there to start a big restoration program, which was installed for the year 1914. It's one of those ironies of history. Soon later, a few weeks later, other troops would arrive, like here, battalion of the British Army that arrives in Ypres. And the first shelling would start. To their amazement, people see that buildings get destroyed, that the first people are getting killed. There is a great bewilderment amongst the civilians. Most stay behind, some others run off. And they go out and look on the ramparts to where the war is at that moment, which is on the hills surrounding the city. And again, that's a very symbolic image. People are very curious about events like that. They're excited by it without fully realizing what the horrors is that lie in front of them. And then the big change is on the 22nd of November. By that time, on those hills, these low ridges lying around the city, they have come to almost a stalemate. The two front lines are very close to each other, and they are in a big semicircle around the city, and that will be called the salient for the next 4 years. It will never be broken, and in its heart, in the center, is this medieval city. And the Germans then decide to shell it. With incendiary bombing, they put fire to the city center because they don't want it to be used by the Allied troops, the French and the British, as winter quarters. They don't want it that the housing could be used for that. That you also kill civilians doing that apparently is not on their mind. That is maybe also a possible arm of terror against the civilian population. We know that since the 4th of August, when the troops invaded Belgium, immediately they started putting pressure, psychological terror amongst the civilians so that maybe the Belgian government would give in and surrender, which didn't happen, as we know. This is 2014, the 22nd of November 2014. So this is at the end, the so-called end of the First Battle of Ypres. In fact, it's not the end, as we will see. The fighting on the salient goes on for months until Christmas almost. But this is like the symbolic end. And you can see the picture to the right. You see that the roof of the cloth hall is in flames. The next day, at the same instant, there's no more roof left. So in one day, all of the city center, there's not one roof still on the houses. The walls are standing, but that's about it. And even the soldiers in this picture, you don't see civilians, you only see soldiers. But that didn't mean that there were not any civilians left. But they are confronted with this now. Their homes have been blown to pieces. It's impossible to live in it. So about half of the civilian population will leave at that point. But meaning that still 8,000 people still live in the city. And they live in cellars mostly, like we see here in this picture. Some are a little better than others, but like you see, very poor conditions where you have to eat and sleep in the same room in a very low medieval cellar. And still 8,000. And they try and continue rescuing their city. Shelling of the library, well, you see in the same day, two pictures, the one to the left and the one to the right, are taken on the same day. And you can see that they try and rescue whatever's left of the books, are put on carts and hopefully will be evacuated. 8,000 people, including children. A picture taken a few days later, and you see that this little girl is looking on the movements on the square. So it is quite an incredible situation, a besieged city, if you want, and civilians trying to cope with it, trying to continue living there. Women going to try and find something to eat, to do their courses that they would normally do. But in the background also a French soldier. And looking at this destruction all around them, quite a telling image. And people organize themselves. There's no council anymore, but since there's still so many people, since there's now a big threat of typhoid fevers amongst the population, well, there is a committee that gets together and says, we will organize this city. And this is a picture taken in December, and like I said, a few days before Christmas, and then the fighting really gets a little less on the salient, on the front lines, and the shelling of the city becomes somewhat smaller. And this is then the next committee, early in 1915. You see it's bigger, it's better organized, there's police, there's the former mayor, there's a few aldermen, a few priests, a very important role of the church in those days. All of that is in this picture, and these people want to run their city as if nothing had happened. Of course, a lot has happened, and a lot of people have been killed, and others are refugees, but still, they continue. They continue. If you look at an image, this is again early 1915, and we focus a little more. This is a vertical aerial picture of the area of the station. Of course, railway lines, very important for fast movement of troops and of goods, and so that gets shelled quite a lot, and you can see the big holes. And for instance, yeah, when you look at this hole, this is what it is. It's a big, huge hole. Probably they start calling it by that time the Ypres Express. The first British soldiers who arrived here in the spring of 1915 say that's the Ypres Express, meaning that is the heavy shells, probably 38 centimeters, possibly 42, we'll never know. But you can see that soldiers and civilians alike try to cope with it. They have shovels and they want to try and fill it in. Now, the picture to the right, the one to the left is taken on the 21st of April 1915. The one on the right is taken on the 22nd, and by the shade and the light, we know it must be around noon. So this is literally hours before the first gas attack. And it's one of the very last images that we have of the civilian population trying to rescue their city and make a living as best as they can. Because then that's what follows. And of course, the big effect is on the soldiers in the front line. Here an image of probably Scottish Canadian near St. Julian, next to a French soldier, gassed and still defending the line. Another picture, one of a series of which the image that stands for this conference is also part of. And these are all dated 23rd of April 1915. The reason is that the on-marching German infantry had taken 4 kilometers of ground, and the order was given to a battalion of Jäger and another battalion of Marines to bury all the corpses between the old front line and the new one. So, out of sanitary reasons, of course. And before they do the burials, they take photographs. And that's how we are so well informed about it. And you can see that there's a number there, down there at the bottom. And that also meant that these photographs were on sale afterwards. They made a little trade of it. A number of them were even turned into postcards. And a number of those postcards that we have in our collection are used for writing home and writing to their loved ones. Some of them have even this awful image of a victim next to that, a victor. And it's how war brutalizes people. That's a very clear example of that. The city, in the meantime, because it's a story about cities, is getting shelled constantly, and people say that on most days it was fires started on 3, 4, 5, 6 places at the same time. But the civilians try and still put all the fires out if they can. And this is, when you look at this picture, you can see this is taken at the final days of April, 28, 29, we're not too sure. And you can see how the fires are there on 5 and 6 places, and indeed what the diary said of the civilians who are still trying to cope with it and still continue living there are proven right by this aerial picture. A few other images. This is just later. If we zoom in, we know it is just later. On the 9th of May, this decision is made. By that time, there had been 4 gas attacks, and each time you could feel the gas fumes and the effects of that well into the city. It never stopped at the front line, so that is quite clear. And so they decide that on military orders, the city will be cleared of civilians. And this is what happened here already. We think there's 2 days between those 2 photographs. And one of the reasons why we believe so, you see the Kartonstraat, with all the houses still intact on the first photograph. You can see on this one street more to the south, there's fires going on. And when you look at the bottom picture, when you look at the Kartonstraat, you see that it's completely burned out. So it's only skeletons in the same street, where you have houses in the first one, you only see skeletons there in the street going there. Beyond that, the old bishop's palace, only a skeleton. So the fire has gone on. And in the diary, you see on the 12th of May, a priest and the warden of the Institute of the Sacré-Cœur that had become a civilian hospital. They have come back, they have returned to try and rescue some more treasures of the city, and they say, nobody is putting out the fires. For months on end, we have every day, after every shelling, we have tried to stop the fires. And now we had to leave the city to the soldiers, and they just let it burn down. And that's exactly what is shown here in these photographs. So, the Warden of the Sacré-Cœur, you see here, this is one of the final images of the city. It's a big institute to the west of the city, and from there all the sick and the wounded and the elderly and people who are in the psychiatric institute are evacuated after the first gas attack. It's one of the most dramatic evacuations of this area, because it's hundreds of people that have to be evacuated all at the same time. And this is probably one of the last pictures of people from Ypres along the same road going in the direction of Popperinge, some 12 kilometers further. And you can see how they are rushing on while the soldiers are using the same road. What happens then for the civilian population after that? The children are taken away in May. They have to go to school colonies in France and Switzerland. Some of them won't see their parents again in another 4 years. Some of them don't have an education in their own language, won't be able hardly to speak any Flemish anymore when they return. And so on and so on. So it is the life on exile after that for the people of Ypres, and it is the story of all times. This is 100 years ago, but it's exactly the same thing as we hear in the news, like almost every day, every night. And here you see a picture. The city is being destroyed. It's an empty place to the civilians. It's only used by soldiers. And you can see the front line curving around the city, and it remains a constant target for the German artillery, because it's still inhabited by soldiers. As you can see, this is an image just to the right of the main gate. That's where on top now the exhibition of the International Peace Bureau is, as you can see just on top of that. This is the life in 1916-17. This is how it looks in 1917. And this is the final picture at the end of the war. You can see it remained a target. It has been totally flattened. So when people then return, it is already the people who are coming to do the excursions, as you can see written on the charabanc there on the right, excursions to the battlefields. They come from Ostend and from Bruges on a day trip to see the horrors of war. But more and more also they are received by the civilians themselves, who are left with a double obligation. One is to resurrect the city, and the other one is to take care of the people who are killed in the war. And that pile of crosses is meant for the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, who will set them out in all the cemeteries that are surrounding the city. And then you have the reconstruction, first living in wooden huts, as I was pointing out. And then slowly, the building that will take the longest to be rebuilt is the centerpiece, is the cloth hall. that we visited yesterday. And you can see, so all the housing around is already there, and you can see in the middle it's still a pile of rubble, called Holy Ground. And in the meantime, the memory of the city, of course, goes on, and you see here the building of the Menin Gate, where we've been as well. And this is the inauguration in 1927. And from then on, the identity of Ypres is a completely different one. People have returned, not necessarily the original population, of the original inhabitants of Ypres, only 50% will ever return. And the other 50% are people who are in reconstruction, who are in rebuilding, but also who are in tourism. People who work with people who come from all over the globe to come and see the battlefields of the First World War, but also who come and see the rebuilt city. And in a way, the rebuilding of the cloth hall continues. This is a picture already of the early 1950s. And I took it because you can see clearly that how this bit is still originally 13th century, and they build on top of that. So they have rebuilt the whole place on the last stone standing. And this is a recent picture where people from all over the world come and visit. This is a festival by the Sea community when they came out a few years ago at the museum. And so this is where last year the European leaders all met, come and visit the museum, and then go to the last post. And it's because of this openness, I think, of the city to welcome everybody from all over the world with this notion of the events of the past, that this was like the one place where the European leaders could go. If you really think of it, it's quite different perspective that European leaders would hold on the meaning of the First World War. For those people, it doesn't mean necessarily the same thing. And because of that acceptance, because of that multi-voiced memory that is used here in Ypres, I think this is the only place they could go to. And this is the ceremony at the Menin Gate. And that's the peace bench that they have inaugurated on top of the gate, where you can see the word peace written in all the different languages all around it, surrounding it. And this is where we have now this magnificent exhibition about the efforts for peace alongside this memento of war. And I think it's a very symbolic image of how it has to go further, how, in a way, answering the question of the chairman, saying this self-evident equation between a war, a past of war, and a future of peace, how we can combine them. That's it. Thank you. This is a little awkward because I have to keep standing here. I'll hand you back the computer first.
Oh, it's okay. You can stay for the next one.
Okay, stay for the next speaker. Okay. Yeah. So what we are doing now is we're going to listen to Dr. Martin Coward. He's a senior lecturer at Newcastle University. His research focuses on the relationship between war and the city. His work on herbicide investigate the deliberate destruction of cities and showed that it should be seen as an attack on the plurality of urban populations. His more recent work on violence against urban infrastructures has shown the vulnerability of cities to attacks on the systems that are vital to their function: transport, power, communications, and so on. His work foregrounds the threat to citizens posed by the way in which cities are increasingly becoming battlegrounds. Dr. Coward, you have the floor.
Thank you. We'll be being joined, I think, via or on audio stream by participants from Italy as well, so welcome to them. And I want to start by saying thank you to both the organisers, Masterpiece, Erin, for the invitation, and fellow participants for some fascinating insights into the variety of threats posed by weapons of mass destruction to both humanity and the city. And in this presentation, I want to talk about threats to the city posed by warfare. And while there's been a lot of discussion yesterday about weapons of mass destruction, I want to think about conventional weapons and the way in which conventional weapons and doctrines of warfare that they are deployed within threaten the city. And while the primary threat to the city is from military forces of states or paramilitary forces, we could also include terrorist and insurgent violence in and against the city in this kind of category of threats to the city from warfare. What's common to these military, paramilitary, terrorist, insurgent violence, the type of violence I want to talk about, is a deliberate targeting of the city itself in order to destroy its essential characteristics, whether these are found in the physical or the human fabric of the city. And I think it's important to point out that the city is not just the people who live there, it's the buildings. And I think this fantastic set of pictures, very tragic and sobering set of pictures from the First World War and the destruction of Ypres demonstrates that the physical fabric isn't much at stake. This, of course, is another city which was flattened. This is Grozny, after Russian forces had shelled it relentlessly for, I think, 3 months in 2000. And again, you can see if you need a demonstration that the horrors of the First World War weren't left behind us. This is what happens to city in the early 21st century. Now, I want to start by noting that there is a general perception that the city should be prohibited as a target. And broadly speaking, I would say this is based on 3 ideas. I've actually, you'll notice, put international humanitarian law down the list, because I think, firstly and foremostly, we all have a general sense that cities are primarily civilian spaces. And indeed, the whole kind of meaning of city as a kind of word in the English language, or urbanity as a term in its etymology over time, has been associated with civility and the civilian, the idea of the civil and the civilian. We also have a sense of the necessity of the fabric of the city, the buildings, the roads, the places, for a distinctive type of civilian life, a distinctively urban type of life that is threatened by the destruction of that physical fabric. And finally, the density of the urban environment and the population within it means that key tenets of international humanitarian law are violated when war comes to the city, particularly the condition of proportionality and the condition of distinction between combatant and non-combatant. The deployment of substantial amounts of force, particularly explosive force, will result in damage to adjacent structures and populations, and so whether intentional or accidental, destructive means have magnified effects in the urban environment, making it hard to satisfy conditions of proportionality and distinction. In fact, I think some people would go as far as to say it's impossible to satisfy those conditions of proportionality and distinction because of the density of the urban environment. As a consequence, targeting the city will normally fail the basic tests of international humanitarian law. This, of course, hasn't prevented people from targeting the city. And this applies just as much to military violence as what we might call terrorism and insurgency. Now, as a consequence, there's a deep ambivalence in military thinking about the relationship between war and the city. variously referred to as the Widowmaker here in a kind of influential military doctrine report by the RAND organisation, dangerous and foreboding places. The city is marked out as a uniquely problematic theatre of operations, and you find a widespread discussion of this problem in both military doctrine and various forms of kind of op-ed commentary around military operations. Military strategists and commanders have taken the experiences of Stalingrad, Hue City in Vietnam, Mogadishu, to name a few instances, to indicate that urban warfare is a last resort to be avoided if possible. And the reason they think about it as a last resort is that typically cities are perceived to be complex spaces crowded with obstacles, both physical and human. The complex geometries of the city, the way that the streets operate and the buildings and the multi-layered nature of the urban environment get in the way of the usual fields of fire, particularly artillery fire, and prevent things like fire and maneuver tactics. Military forces find themselves in crowded spaces where there's just insufficient distance between them and civilians and enemy forces. And in what I find to be one of the most bizarre euphemisms used in military doctrine, this creates the so-called danger of being hugged by enemy forces, making it hard to distinguish between civilian and military forces because the distance between the military and the civilian becomes so reduced to the point where you're almost in contact room by room, block by block in the city. As such, the urban environment prevents military forces from operating effectively and opens them up to high rates of fatality, as well as raising the spectre of high rates of civilian casualties. And it's therefore perceived as frustrating and dangerous. This hasn't stopped militaries from operating in cities, but it's given rise to a deep ambivalence in military doctrine. It's also assumed that it would take a desperate, because of these dangers, it's assumed it would take a desperate force to retreat into the city in order to benefit from the way in which the city frustrates oncoming military forces. So while the city is sometimes referred to as a way of levelling the playing field between asymmetric forces, for example, this is often used in the discussion of the US Army and its confrontation with Iraqi insurgents in Fallujah, it's also assumed that you would have to be desperate to take that measure of retreating into the city, because you would know that the consequences would be destruction of the human and physical fabric of the city. So by the end of the 20th century, there was a sense amongst the world's major military forces, particularly their strategists and commanders, the city was to be proscribed as an area of operations. I think this is most clearly seen in the what's referred to in the US as the first Gulf War, not the Iran-Iraq War, but the first Allied engagement in 1991 in Kuwait, and the decision not to move forces forward to Baghdad, partly because, as commanders and strategists warned, this would involve urban operations. However, I want to say, and I want to come back to this in a minute, because it's the central message of what I want to talk about today, a lot of doctrinal ink has been spilled trying to square the circle of this ambivalence about complex terrain in which civilian and urban fabric are at stake to make military strategy in cities possible. And I'll return to that because I think that some military strategists and some military forces are beginning to square this circle in very dangerous ways. However, there's a deeper reason for thinking that the city should be a prohibited target, not just the kind of collateral from, the inevitable collateral from military operations. There's a sense there's a different form of violence against the city that should be confronted as a matter of urgency. However, destructive episodes such as major urban battles, Stalingrad for example, the damage they inflict is a consequence of an inability to contain organised violence when the city becomes a theatre of operations. This is not a deliberate destruction of the city itself, but a destruction of the city as a means to the end of the destruction of enemy forces. This doesn't make it any less illegitimate or any less serious, but it's a different type of violence to another kind of violence I want to talk about. In contrast to military collateral damage to the city, there is a deliberate targeting of the cities as an entity in their own right. And there's a significant amount of concern about this deliberate targeting. We might say that historically, high explosive and incendiary devices, nuclear and chemical weapons have been used to attack the city in itself, not simply segments of the population, not simply military elements of the city, not to just deny it as a strategic position, but to attack the very idea of the city as both a place and a way of life. This is a picture of Sarajevo in 1996. These are the emblematic Ypres towers, and I would argue that Sarajevo suffered this kind of attack as an attack on the idea of the city as both a place and a particular way of life. Dealt with chemical and nuclear threats yesterday, so I'll talk about conventional incendiary threats and the way in which they're not, this isn't simply a matter of military operations in cities causing unacceptable damage due to the density of the urban environment, but an actual targeting of the idea of the city itself. Two examples I think are important. First, this is a picture of Dresden, obviously after the Allied firebombing in the Second World War. The first example I would choose is precisely shelling and strategic bombing, or the transition from shelling to strategic bombing in World War I to World War II. In World War I, as you've seen from the pictures of Ypres, cities are targeted. They're often targeted because they constitute key strategic crossroads or key places where military assets are based, troops are billeted, and so on and so forth. There is, according to some, a much wider culture of annihilation, particularly in German military doctrine at the time, which was an odd historical translation of Karl von Clausewitz's idea of total war, which leads to sort of partial destructions of the city in itself. Louvain, for example, Treviso in Italy, can be marked out as deliberate destruction of cultural heritage that was specific to those urban environments. This went above and beyond destroying a city because it could be a place where you move troops through or where you station those troops, and became a targeting of the very idea of those cities as representative of culture, for example, representative of a distinctive kind of culture. Now this destruction, despite what happened to Ypres, was limited in World War I by the capacity of both artillery and air power. However, these limitations were overcome by the time we arrive at World War II, and they're overcome by considerable deliberate efforts to organize strategic bombing campaigns in World War II. For example, the United States invested significant resources in the National Defense Research Council tests at Dugway, Utah. These were a series of tests where they constructed fake German and Japanese villages and then they bombed them in order to determine the most destructive patterns of incendiary bombing. These tests culminated in the 1945 raids on Tokyo and other Japanese cities. Similarly, the RAF learned, in fact the RAF led the way. There's initial hesitance from the US to get involved in strategic bombing. The RAF learned from raids on Lübeck and Hamburg and developed bombing capabilities that would culminate in the firestorm at Dresden. So what I want to say here is that strategic bombing follows a pattern of experimentation to determine which combination of high explosives and incendiary devices will cause the maximum loss of urban fabric. And this is an important point. This isn't about destroying rail yards, it isn't about destroying factories, it's about actually destroying the urban fabric itself. In fact, British government's chief scientific advisor refers to this policy as dehousing, the deliberate destruction of urban housing stock to affect civilian morale. And the pattern of destruction demonstrates that the targeting of towns and cities was deliberate. It sought to destroy the urban fabric, and the way in which this was an attack on the idea of the city itself. And I think this is recognised very much in the ongoing memorialisation of Dresden, that this was greater than a sort of military operation in urban terrain that exceeded its kind of where the effects were magnified, but was actually an attack on the idea of Dresden as a city, as a place where civilian urban life could occur. The second example I want to look at is herbicide, and particularly in the context of the ethnic national violence that marked the 1992 to 1995 Bosnian War. This conflict witnessed widespread, deliberate destruction of cities. And it was referred to by Bosnian architects as herbicide. The term itself actually goes probably goes back, although I'm always wary about origin myths, but probably goes back to the US, probably goes back to discussions in New York Times in the 50s about US planning and the way in which planning decisions in New York were affecting the kind of character of the city. But it was revived in 1992, particularly in relation to the shelling of Sarajevo and Moscow. The destruction was notable for the way in which it targeted not only cultural heritage, mosques, churches, significant monuments and so on, but also the mundane elements of the urban fabric, car parks, office blocks, deliberately. And it's been interpreted as an attack on the fabric of the city in order to destroy its defining characteristics, particularly the plurality of its public spaces. The destruction of cultural heritage comprises an enforced forgetting of a history of coexistence. But the destruction of houses, shops, office blocks and car parks is an assault on the shared common spaces of the city, in and around which a plurality of citizens can encounter one another on a daily basis. Herbicide is thus an attack on the physical fabric of the city in order to prevent city dwellers from living a distinctively urban way of life, characterized by plurality, underpinned by the way that buildings make shared spaces. Two things to say here. One is that one of the things is that the modern city has often been said to be defined by the diversity and plurality of its populations. From Max Weber's discussions about what makes the city important in terms of the transformation of Europe in the age of industrialization, through to people thinking about the nature of urbanization in America in the 50s and so on, diversity, plurality have been taken as the defining characteristics of the city. However much a city gets segregated, it is still the case that it is host to multiple ways of life. In fact, segregation is evidence of multiple ways of life inhabiting the city. This diversity is often seen as a product of the physical fabric of the city, the way that the physical fabric of the city creates public spaces, shared places, in and around which encounters with others not like us might happen. Of course, then attacking the physical fabric of the city are not just attacks on the population in order to kill large numbers of individuals. That undeniably happens. But they are an attack on the physical fabric of the city in order to remove the structures that facilitate these encounters, which bring about the plurality taken to be a defining feature of urban life. This is why herbicide is translated by some as killing the city, killing what makes the defining feature of the city, the very identity of the city, its diversity and plurality possible. As such, there's a strong sense that there should be a prohibition on violence against the city. To make deliberate targeting of the city like this illegitimate precisely because of the way in which it targets the underpinning of a distinctively urban way of life. So, for example, those seeking to protect cultural heritage have found the concept of herbicide useful insofar as it indicates that the destruction of buildings is deliberate, it's not a kind of collateral accident, and it's aimed not simply at a population, but at a more general characteristic of the city that is, like heritage, accessible by all, the shared spaces, the shared places, and so on. And similarly, the prosecutions at places like the International Criminal Tribunal for former Yugoslavia for the wanton destruction of cities, a phrase that's, to my mind, in need of updating, serves as a warning to aggressors that widespread deliberate destruction of cities will be regarded as a war crime, a violation of the usual rules of warfare. I think this is very important as we enter into a phase of planetary urbanization where more than half of the world's population live in cities. This sense that there should be a prohibition against the deliberate targeting of the city is important. However, sorry, International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. Sorry, that was a bit of a mouthful, I couldn't fit it on the slide. Sorry. Yeah, do stop me if it's not clear, please. However, I don't want to stop there because that would give, I think, a false impression. Because I think that there's a very pressing sense in which the prohibition against targeting the city has been weakened in the last 15 to 20 years by a renewed interest in the city as a theatre of military operations. Indeed, in the early 21st century, a significant volume of military doctrine has emerged, arguing that technology and tactics can combine to enable militaries to operate within the city. This is an illustration from, it's from Military Doctrine, Field Manual 3-06, which is on urban operations. It's, I won't pretend it's not a fascinating read, but it's a very interesting read. And this is an illustration of the complexity, this is an illustration for US forces, of the three-dimensionality and complexity of the city space. It's an early illustration in the manual, which then goes on to examine the various technological ways to overcome this complexity. At the same time, insurgent forces have come to see the city as a force multiplier, and as such the city is increasingly regarded not as a proscribed space of operations, but as an inevitable arena for future conflict. And here I'm thinking about somebody like David Kilcullen, who is a US counterinsurgency guru who advised US counterinsurgency operations, was close to Petraeus when they revised US counterinsurgency operations in Iraq and then moving on to Afghanistan, whose book Out of the Mountains I think is an extremely instructive case in which the prohibition about military operations in cities is gradually eroded. In fact, Kilcullen says all future conflicts will be in cities and militaries must find ways to fight in cities. Nowhere is this clearer to my mind than in the efforts expended by both military forces and insurgent forces to destroy infrastructure. Susan Lee Starr, who's a sociologist, has done some very interesting work about infrastructure. She refers to infrastructure as the boring things, the things that we tend to forget, the banal elements of the urban environment, the things that are under our feet, in our walls, largely invisible to us, would make our lives in cities functions. Power and water distribution, waste removal, data cables, logistics and transport, roads, rails, and so on and so forth. Often thought as subsidiary to human populations, infrastructure destruction can cripple cities and deprive communities of basic necessities with frightening speed. So here are some things to think about. Belgrade in 1999. This is not, it's not a very good graphic. I'm sorry, I couldn't find a better illustration. This is the BLU 114. This is a weapon that was dropped on Belgrade in 1999 in the NATO action. It's a munition that releases a series of graphite filaments, and it's credited with triggering massive short circuits at switching stations and causing the power grid in Serbia to shut down. In fact, Jamie Shea, the NATO spokesman, said at the time lights went out across 70% of the country. Right? This was justified because it apparently disrupted military communications, but you can immediately see the effects it will have on the civilian population. This munition is actually a development of an earlier munition that was used in 1991 to destroy Iraq's electricity grid, and we all know about the subsequent reports that said the destruction of infrastructure in Iraq had led to enormous civilian suffering. We could also think about the various attacks by terrorist or insurgent, however you want to refer to these organisations, on transport infrastructures, which have been undeniably an attack on people in those trains, but also an attack on the way in which that transport connects up cities. It's no accident that on the 7th of July, 2005, the London Underground was bombed, not simply because it was a confined space where you could kill a number of people, but also because it crippled the city. The research into the effects of that disruption of transport were very interesting in the way that they affected people's behaviour, changed a number of delivery of essential services and so on. You could look at the destruction of gas pipelines, for example. A researcher who I work with was in Islamabad over Christmas, and they lost gas supply for 2 days because gas pipelines in Balochistan were destroyed by the Baluch Republican Army, leading to a gas shortage for the whole of, in fact, a gas outage for the whole of Punjab province for 2 days. Of course, when gas goes, so does things like cooking, and you can imagine how that cascades onwards. And a non-violent example, because it's a good one in showing how logistics networks can get affected. In the year 2000, the UK was affected by fuel protests, a blockade of fuel depots. The interesting thing about this is not just that fuel begins to become in short supply, but supermarkets, logistics chains begin to become threatened. It takes about 3 or 4 days for the government to resolve this, 3 or 4 days. But by the end, there are questions about whether the shelves will still be full in supermarkets and so on. Now I want to say 2 things before I finish and taking questions if there are any. There are 3 problems this raises. The first is, it's not bloodless. When the lights go out, so do the basic support functions of the city. Refrigeration fails, medical equipment has to rely on auxiliary power, firefighting equipment is often rendered close to useless, traffic control signal fail, and so on. Without electricity for more than a few days, the city will face serious risks to human life. So what appears to be simple destruction of things becomes an assault on the population of the city. If plurality is about encountering others, it's about being connected to others. Infrastructure is the connective tissue that binds the city together as a place where we mix and meet. So an attack on infrastructure is an attack on the distinctive characteristics of urban life. And finally, and perhaps most importantly to my mind, the ability to target infrastructure tempts forces into the city. And here, one of the things that I haven't got time to really flesh out now, but there has come to be a predominant way of thinking about cities, thinking about them as networks, and a predominant way of thinking about urban operations as operations that have to take a networked form, both in terms of targeting networks and in terms of being organised around networks, and that this tempts military forces into thinking about targeting elements of the urban environment as targeting discrete nodes in infrastructures. And this tempts them to begin to think about urban operations as a legitimate, possible endeavour. Now, what would we want to protect? Well, I think we want to protect the things I've spoken about. We want to talk about, we want to protect power, water distribution and sewage, food logistics, transport infrastructures, and also communication infrastructures. I'm not talking about the right to Wi-Fi, but we would want to think about the kinds of communications, the kind of data and the way it's communicated that make our everyday life possible. What happens when we heard yesterday about the problem around physicians in cities in cases of extreme violence, but what happens when people can't get access to medical notes, for example, when a banking system fails, and so on and so forth. This leads me to 3 final quick points. The first is that infrastructures are interdependent in very complicated ways. And attacks on one infrastructure, electricity for example, has cascading effects into others, logistics, sewage removal, so on and so forth. Attacks on infrastructure cannot therefore be described as precise in any sense. And I think that the myth of precision has become this kind of great flaw in doctrinal thinking that has re-enchanted the idea of operation in urban terrain. They should be seen as disproportionate and undifferentiated. It's not possible to remove one particular bit of infrastructure in a proportionate and undifferentiated way without having effects that cascade onto elements of the population, elements of the city that weren't intended. So the myth of the precise and limited nature of these attacks should be vigorously contested. But perhaps more importantly, and perhaps this is where I want to kind of add my concluding thoughts, these infrastructures support the urban population. Not just in a physical sense, of course power, water, food and necessary survival, but also in the sense that they make a sort of urban life possible. They connect various individuals and communities in various kinds of ways. They generate the sense in which there are encounters with others in a particular space. So they are the way in which, in an era of planetary urbanization, this plurality of the city is generated. We could therefore say that urban populations have a right to these infrastructures as a way of maintaining their urban characteristics. Now, of course, one of the reasons why I'd say this is not just to protect the city against military attack, but also to say that we would also have a political tool to deal with those communities that have what we might call infrastructure deficits, places where urbanisation is informal, unrecognised, or underdeveloped in various senses. So that this right to the city is not just a right to protection against military attack, but also a way of beginning to think about a sustainable development of the city. So I think that these questions around the sort of re-enchantment of the city as a terrain of operations and the way in which infrastructure has become a sort of central element in this re-enchantment of the city as a target is important. If we're not careful, military forces will be tempted back into the city to capitalise on the perceived utility of targeting infrastructure. And I think we mustn't let this re-enchantment of the city as a target happen. Thank you.
Any questions, please? Comments to this fascinating insight? Yes? Nobody else wants to have a go. Firstly, thanks very much, Rob. It's a really fascinating tour of the problem and the relationship with other areas. But one reaction I have is this. I wonder whether these attacks on the city are always an attack on the idea of the city. I mean, there's your picture of Grozny, total destruction. But if you look at, well, that's interesting. You see, you put up, in fact, the last picture is what Grozny looks like now. Grozny has been massively redeveloped and modernized by the Russians, by Mr. Kadyrov, who's Mr. Putin's man, So the question is not, do we want to attack a city, but who's in charge? Whose city is it? The attack on Sarajevo was an attack on a Bosniak Muslim community, essentially, this mixed space that was contesting ethnic cleansing. So it's okay to rebuild the city if we're in charge. Look at Islamic State. I mean, they haven't destroyed Mosul, they're continuing to run Mosul. They want it under their control. So the city, for me, is a contested space between power structures with their militaries. It's not that people want to get rid of the city as a city. It seems to be your thesis. I just wonder if you would respond to that one.
So I think that's a really good question. I mean, I would say two things. One is, I think that not all types of violence against the city are the same.
Right.
I think that's important. And I think that we should think so that, for example, there are military operations in urban terrain where the effects are undeniably of illegitimate, disproportionate use of force, but it's not an intentional targeting of the diversity of the city. So I've said elsewhere that I think that the rush to embrace herbicide as a kind of undifferentiated category is problematic, because then it comes to mean everything and nothing. Right? However, and I think this is the second thing I would say, you don't have to level a city to destroy what's distinctive about a city. And I think that's quite important. What's at stake in Grozny, I think, and what's at stake in Sarajevo It's not necessarily an erasure of the city from the map, but a denial, an attack on a form of plurality that was offensive to those that were attacking the city. And what you find, particularly in the case of Sarajevo, I mean, I think in the case of Grozny, what you have is a fairly tragic outcome in which, yeah, the city's been rebuilt, the city lives on, but the plurality expressed by the desire to not be part of the greater Russian project, we could say, putting it very crudely, has been squashed. Right? I think in the case of Sarajevo, what you have is a very interesting example in which there is a concerted effort. We can ask questions about why this happens in the case of Sarajevo and not in the case of Grozny. But there is a concerted effort to protect the distinctive plurality that makes the city from being destroyed. And we could argue that another city just south of there, Mostar, has precisely that kind of plurality contested really quite vigorously. And there's a 10-year period where there's a large dead space in the middle of Mostar that raises the question about whether it actually exists as a single city anymore, because the kind of plurality that characterizes the city, the possibility of encounters with different ways of life, doesn't exist anymore in Mostar. And you get these kind of two different cities emerging, despite the fact you haven't leveled the city. So I think, I see what you're saying, and I don't think we just have to look for erasure from the map. It's slightly more complicated.
One more. I took a trip in Southeast Asia, and was in Phnom Penh. Now there's an example where the city was untouched.
Yeah.
The Khmer Rouge forced everyone to leave the city, and it turned into a ghost town for about 3 years or something like that. And then everyone more or less came back with all the scars of the genocide that occurred. So this also raises the question of, is it okay to destroy a city after it's been evacuated? And these are all things that we're going to need to think through quite carefully when we approach this issue. I want to mention that in the Ypres project, the boat is not going to Hamburg in Germany, it's going to Warnemünde on the coast. But we've arranged with the city of Hamburg to bring a group of the Habakkuk to meet with survivors of the Hamburg firestorm, which I think is the first ever encounter of that kind. There are so many similarities, but there also I think we need to think about this business of diversity. Hiroshima was probably one of the, well, except for the Koreans, there was a significant Korean population in Hiroshima. The Koreans and the Japanese, and that was it. And likewise, Hamburg was quite a homogeneous city. So I think we need to look for other aspects of a city other than the diversity and plurality that are impacted. And I'm glad you went on to talk about the infrastructure, because that, of course, is critically important. You simply can't bring people into such an intense interaction, economically, culturally, and so forth, without having that infrastructure to make life work at that level of density. Those are some thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I think that those are two very interesting reflections. I think on the case of Phnom Penh, what I find particularly interesting, and I've had exchanges about this, I think it's important to point out that just as I think the types of violence against the city should be differentiated, we shouldn't just lump them under one category. I don't think that just because I'm here talking about deliberate destruction of the city, I don't think that's more or less important than other types of violence, right? Which means that, for example, herbicide in Sarajevo coexists with genocide, for example. And I don't want to argue that either of those is more important. I think it's an important point. What I find interesting about the case of Phnom Penh is that, again, there's a targeting here because of the way in which the urban populations were perceived by a radically homogenizing regime as a kind of unruly mob that was different to it. Right? And I think this is actually a really important point. So when Lewis Worth comes to discuss the characteristics of cities in Chicago, right? This is where he's writing from. Yeah, sure, I mean, you know, you have this sense of American cities as these melting pots, right? But we immediately come back to the idea of difference as ethnic difference. Right? That's a product, I think, of our particular time. But he says it's not about ethnic difference. This is Max Weber when he's writing about German cities. He's not talking about ethnic difference. There are all kinds of forms of difference in the city that can be attacked in various ways. You know, that even if Newcastle's not a particularly diverse city, but there are all kinds of other ways of living there that I have to encounter in my everyday walking through the shared spaces. Class, gender, sexuality. So these are the kinds of things that could be at stake when we lose public spaces, shared spaces.
Right. On that note, we have a short break and see each other again at 11. Which is only 7 minutes. It's a bit short, really.
Sorry.
We'll make that 11:15.